This will be our final video on World War I. The armistice that would eventually mark the end of the fighting in the Great War went into effect on Monday, November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m. This armistice, set on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, was only a temporary agreement to stop the fighting. While the armistice officially ended the Great War, the peace negotiations and resulting treaty yet to come would prove problematic. Paris Peace Conference. Peace negotiations took place in Paris in January 1919. The talks were dominated by the big three Allied leaders of President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Premier George Clemenceau of France, and Prime Minister David Lloyd George of England. Also shown in the picture is Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy. While representatives from 27 countries participated in negotiation talks, the defeated powers were not invited. No, thank you, Germany. Another notable absence was Russia. The Russians were engaged in civil war and did not attend. It took only 6 months before the final treaty addressing peace with Germany was agreed upon and signed. 4 other treaties dealing with Austria, Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria soon followed. Known as the Treaty of Versailles. On June 28, 1919, at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, representatives of Germany's new Weimar Republic, formed after the Kaiser had abdicated, had to sign a treaty without having had input into any of its terms. The treaty was signed on the anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which had started the war. The Versailles Treaty's harsh conditions and unrealistic requirements for reparations angered the German people, helped contribute to an economic depression that would affect all of Europe, and failed to resolve the underlying reasons for many conflicts on the continent. The treaty's basic conditions included 1. Germany had to cede the region of Alsace-Lorraine, which it had won in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. And they had to give this land back to France. The Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia had to be returned, and the Polish corridor was given to the new formed nation of Poland. 2. Demilitarization of the Rhineland. The Germans could not have the military near French border. 3. Germany's Saar coal region was placed under international control for 15 years, so their natural resources were taken away too. 4. Disarmament. Germany was limited to only 100,000 army troops. No reserves, tanks, aircraft, warships, or subs were permitted. 5. Germany had to pay $5 billion in immediate reparations, with future reparations to be determined by 1921. Now, some saw this treaty as overly punishing. They felt that rather than setting terms to ensure lasting peace in Europe, the treaty instead was designed to make Germany suffer more. Being stripped of a real army and having to give up large chunks of its territory was humiliating. But the reparations required were crippling. All told, Germany would be expected to pay over $33 billion in reparations, an impossible amount for the war-devastated country. President Woodrow Wilson outlined a plan for peace called the 14 Points. In an address to Congress on January 8, 1918, his plan for peace was based on research from a group of experts. The inquiry, formed in the fall of 1917, faced the task of identifying feasible war aims for the U.S. and determining war goals for the other countries involved. Wilson ultimately found it impossible to convince all European allies that a peace without victory was in the best interest. European leaders either dismissed most of the ideas of the 14 points or diluted them in the final peace agreement. The 14 points were 1. Open diplomacy, no secret treaties like Russia had with Germany, no more secret treaties. 2. Freedom of the seas in war and in peace. 3. Removal of all economic barriers, no more tariffs. No more taxes for trade. 4. Reduction in national military forces. Militarism had been a big cause of World War One. One of the 14 points was to say, let's stop building up the military so big. Number 5, colonial disputes judged impartially. Subjected peoples have equal voice with colonial powers. So give people the power in your colonies. 6, withdraw all German and Austrian forces from Russian territory. 7, restoration of Belgian sovereignty. 8, occupied French territory restored, including Alsace-Lorraine. 9, borders of Italian frontiers redrawn according to national identity. 10, peoples of Austria-Hungary given opportunity for autonomy. Well, that's kind of how this whole war started. The Slavs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire wanted to be independent. 11, autonomous Balkan states. 12, non-Turks within Ottoman Empire given opportunity for autonomy. 13, establish of a Polish state with sea access. 14, formation of the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations. So let's talk more about the League of Nations. The League of Nations lived a short and inglorious life from 1919 till 1939 when World War II began. The League was an important component of the Versailles Treaty, and a plan for the organization was put into place on February 14, 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference. President Woodrow Wilson was given the task of writing the League's covenant, and, with the exception of Germany and Russia, any country that signed the peace treaties could be part of the New World Organization. The League's development, however, suffered a key setback when the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty. Many senators objected to the treaty primarily because of the League of Nations. They felt that the League's charter committed the U.S. to comply with any of the League's decisions, and thus undermined the U.S. sovereignty. Wilson embarked on a countrywide speaking tour in order to get the public to pressure the Senate to ratify the treaty. He ended up suffering a stroke from the strain of the tour, but the Senate ultimately rejected it. In 1921, the U.S. finally put a formal conclusion to the war by signing separate treaties with Germany, Austria, and Hungary. The U.S. never did join the League of Nations. The League proved to be an impotent, powerless organization that many countries manipulated to advance their own goals rather than to administer justice. Inconsistencies in purpose and administration prevented the League from ever fulfilling the ideal of becoming a world governing body that settled disputes, promoted disarmament, and supervised world health. Numbers of wounded. Take a moment to look at these charts. On the Central Powers, we see Austria-Hungary and Germany take the lion's share of wounded, with Germany having the most. Allied powers, it was Russia who suffered the most, which makes it more understandable why they demanded to exit the war early. They were suffering more than anyone. The United States, for its part, was the least affected, losing 204,000 soldiers. Now the deaths. Well, the Germans, almost half of all the deaths on the Central Powers were German deaths. And the Allied powers, it was again Russia who would lose the most, with France in second place. The United States would lose 116,000 troops, or 2% of the entire Allied losses. The war exacted a huge physical and financial toll on the population of Europe. The war wiped out entire villages, and even some cities were wiped out by the fighting. Much of the fighting in France had destroyed valuable farmland, thus farmers had lost both their animals and their land, a development that contributed to food shortages after the war. As a result of the lingering bitterness between nations and ethnicities, food shortages, economic depression, and trade issues continued after the fighting. Countries such as France and Great Britain had borrowed heavily to finance the war and were now deeply in debt to lender countries like the United States. European society was put in a state of upheaval. The political map of Europe was redrawn, often along ethnic lines. Some of these boundary changes would lead to future unrest. Several Balkan states united into one Yugoslavia, for example. This led many people to leave familiar lands to find their own kind. Once the refugees relocated, they were often rejected by their ethnic kin because of competition for food and jobs. Also, loss of land by once powerful European empires like Austria Hungary led to a bitter feeling towards neighboring countries. The war inspired an outburst of creativity as writers and artists found a number of different ways to express the emotions evoked by the conflict. The poets Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg tried to capture the tragedy of war in their writing. Visual imagery emerged in movies that became popular in the 1920s. Short comedies like The Keystone Cops and featured starring Rudolph Valentino became a dominant force in entertainment. Soldier painters such as Otto Dix and Stanley Spencer influenced the art world. Several years after the war had ended, novels like Erich Maria Remennik's All Quiet on the Western Front would emerge to bring further clarity and insight as to the impact of the Great War. Well, many new nations were created because of World War One. Many it completely redrew the map of Europe. Ireland, for instance, the Irish Republican Party broke away from Britain and formed its own country. Austria Hungary was broken down. In an attempt to resolve ethnic tensions, Austria Hungary was carved into four new nations. The country of Austria was created, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. In addition, other parts of the former Austro Hungarian Empire were parceled out to adjacent countries, like Romania, Poland, and Italy. While the effort did create homelands for some ethnicities, it created other problems as the new majority ethnicities oppressed the remaining minorities. Widespread ethnic cleansing accommodated the Yugoslav War from 1991 to 1999, of which the most significant examples occurred in eastern Croatia and Krajina, in most of Bosnia, and an Albanian-dominated breakaway province of Serbia called Kosovo. Large numbers of Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and Albanians were forced to flee their homes and were expelled from their countries. In 2004, following an upsurge in violence, Serbs were forced by Albanian rioters to flee their homes in the province. These ethnic tensions in the Balkans are still here today. The new Middle East. Despite earlier promises by the British to grant self determination to the Arab nation, the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France left it up to the two nations to divide and control Arab lands as they saw fit. Following the war, mandates, or trusteeships, were established over former Turkish-controlled territories. The British and French controlled much of this area. In a 1917 document called the Balfour Declaration, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour stated in a letter to Jewish leader Lord Rothschild that his government supported the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Most Arab states opposed the creation of a Jewish state, and when the United Nations voted to establish Israel, the Arab countries immediately attacked the new state, but were defeated. Arab feelings of betrayal at this time set the stage for the anti Western views that still dominate many Arab nations today. Japan and Russia. As the war raged in Europe, imperial nations ignored their East Asian colonies. Japan saw an opportunity to step into this vacuum and expand its influence over mainland China and benefit from the country's natural resources. As Japan expanded its empire, militaristic extremists gained in popularity and power on the mainland, on the island. Japan's main homeland. Let's talk about Russia. Following Lenin's death in 1924 due to stroke, Joseph Stalin assumed leadership of the Soviet Union. Stalin consolidated all state power in himself, then set the USSR on a course of modernization that brought industry and order to the vast country. At the same time, his paranoia led to the imprisonment and murder of millions of people who disagreed with his policies or threatened his power. Stalin is one of the greatest mass murderers in human history, and it was his own people who he was murdering. There was widespread dissatisfaction with Germany's new Weimar government. To address the $33 billion in reparations, the government simply printed more paper money. This increase in Deutschmarks, their money, created hyperinflation. At one point, 1 billion Deutschmarks equaled about 1 American cent. Humiliated by the concessions of the Versailles Treaty, had forced them to make, some Germans sought to rebuild national pride by joining extreme right wing and nationalistic political movements, including the National Socialist Party, which came to be known as the Nazis. Adolf Hitler, an Austrian born German who had served as a corporal in the Great War, rose to become leader of the party, the Nazi Party, and eventually became dictator of Germany in 1933. In Italy, the newly formed fascist party set out to distinguish itself from the socialists and communists by promoting an extreme nationalism and promising to restore to the nation the glory of ancient Rome. The fasces, a bundle of sticks wrapped around an X, was one of the symbols of Rome. Benito Mussolini, the leader of the fascists, became dictator of Italy in 1924. Though the fascists employed brutal, repressive tactics, Mussolini's government also brought efficiency and productivity to the factories. As life improved, citizens became tolerant of the fascists' heavy-handed regime. After the brutality of the Great War, many Americans came to believe that the United States' interests should not be tied to those of Europe. Consequently, the U.S. became isolationist again, withdrawing from taking any major role in European affairs. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, the U.S. became even more isolationist as it struggled to solve economic problems at home. While socialist and communist groups were gaining power in Europe, the U.S. became more and more suspicious of all Reds. In 1919, bombs were set off in several American cities. One of them damaged the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Palmer believed the bombing signaled an attempt by radicals and subversives to overthrow the government. In 1919 and 1920, Palmer directed the Justice Department to conduct raids and arrest many communists, socialists, and anarchists, those who sought the destruction of the United States. Most arrested were completely innocent, though. Only a few were convicted, but more than 500 were deported. Post-war Europe was beset by instability. The defeat of the Central Powers resulted in the creation of new nations, new governments, and a whole new set of challenges. Dictators emerged, and fascism, fostered by poor economic conditions, began to spread. You see here on the map, the purple, or the area that Russia gave to Germany when it signed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. It had to give up this land in order to end the war. This land, after the war, all became independent countries: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. The blue areas are what came out of the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These are some discussion questions for your final video, World War I.